In this video, we are going to delve a little further into Chapter 10 and take a slightly closer look at labor statistics and their implications. When we look at India as a whole, 49.5% of people are estimated to be self-employed, while 50.5% are estimated to be hired workers. Furthermore, of the hired workers, roughly 31% are casual workers, 17% are regular workers, and the remaining 3% are contract employees. Although there are many inferences that can be made from this data, the textbook focuses on an issue that is not discernible from this data, namely, the differences between urban and rural populations. The key takeaway is that in urban markets, there are far more employment opportunities for hired workers as firms tend to gather in urban areas, while those in rural areas are primarily dependent on agriculture and as a result are self-employed. The textbook also focuses on the gender breakdown, which attempts to illustrate that women have fewer employment opportunities to work outside of the home and hence are limited to work at home or engage in self-employment opportunities. However, unfortunately, the statistical data in the book does not support those conclusions, as only 45.7% of women are self-employed. If the data supported these well-known conclusions about the plight of women in India, we should see that a far greater percentage of Indian women are engaged in self-employed endeavors. A simple Google search on the rate of self-employed women in India will lead you to hundreds of different pages, each of which providing different statistics, leading to the simple conclusion that no one knows what the exact statistics in India are, but the result that women in India have fewer employment opportunities outside of the home cannot be denied. The next section in this textbook focuses on the occupational distribution of the workforce and breaks down the percentage in terms of primary, secondary, and tertiary workers, which are 46.9%, 22.2%, and 30.9% respectively. By now, you should have a firm understanding of these definitions, and if you don't, I recommend you go back to one of the earlier videos towards the beginning of this textbook. As you can easily imagine, in urban areas, the majority of employment opportunities have to be in the tertiary sector, while in rural areas, the majority of opportunities are primarily in the primary sector. The reasons for this are pretty obvious. The number of agricultural opportunities in urban settings the world over are limited, and hence implying that primary sector jobs are limited in supply in urban areas, while the opposite is true for manufacturing and finance-related opportunities in rural settings. Moreover, breaking down these statistics by gender, we notice that while the number of people employed in the primary sector remains the largest, and the tertiary and secondary sector is falling behind, the relative percentage of women in the primary sector is far greater than that for men, for reasons which I've already mentioned earlier. And finally, in this section, we take a look at the percentage of how people employed in these sectors has changed over time. Between 1950 and 2013, the percentage of people engaged in employment in the primary sector has fallen significantly, while employment in the two other sectors has rapidly increased. You should realize by now that this is a sign of modernization and development of the Indian economy. And lastly, in the 7th section of this chapter, the discussion is that of jobless growth. Simply said, jobless growth occurs when GDP increases without an accompanying increase in employment, effectively meaning that efficiency improvements and technology improvements have led to increased GDP and decreased employment opportunities. In developed nations, this is clearly seen as a positive result as efficient returns are lauded by shareholders. But in the developing world, this type of result can have detrimental effects on a nation. Let's consider the case of driverless automated taxis. In many developed societies, this type of technological advancement is considered a boon to society as it will lead to reduced transportation costs and increased user satisfaction. The reduced costs are directly as a result of not having to pay fees for a driver, while apps will make the delivery of such taxi services highly efficient and effective. However, in terms of India, if India were to introduce this technology, as much of the modern world is beginning to do, then hundreds, possibly thousands of people who are presently employed as taxi drivers will be out of work. And thus, they will begin to be a burden on the Indian society as they have no other employable skills. So when looking at technological advancement as a way to improve efficiency and hence GDP, this may not be an ideal solution in India. However, in Japan, it may be an ideal solution because taxi drivers can be retrained or have transferable skills that can be put to use in other areas. And that brings us to the end of this second video in chapter 10, and the third video will wrap up this entire chapter.